Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for the organizers. I am delighted to be here and a little bit humbled after watching the last performance because I can't move that way, and also humbled by many of the other comments. I think the day so far has been very rich. It's been full of incredible insights and incredible energy and incredible kind of wisdom. And I'd like to, in a sense, bring this back to something, as many of you know, I teach here at Oxford and I work with many of you in classes and projects. I'd like to bring our discussion back to something kind of about impact and action. We've heard big ideas and we've heard insights about reinvention, about ecosystems, about authenticity. We've heard, lots of incredible ideas. We heard about empathy. We've heard lots and lots of incredible ideas and powerful insights. And I'd like to shift us back to thinking about how does this happen? How does it get done in a less agency-filled view? How do things happen? And I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking to you about, I'd like to organize my comments, I guess, by making a critique of the idea of an entrepreneur, something that we all love and care about. I'd like to ask you to reflect a bit critically on that word, and to instead think about the idea of system builders. I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of examples. And in a sense, I think going back to something that Jeremy mentioned, some others have mentioned today, I'd like you to think about meaning as well, meaning and action both. I think words matter. I guess the first one I make is words matter. The word entrepreneur is powerful, it's pervasive. We live in a time, even though we're at Oxford, we live in a time that values innovation and that celebrates entrepreneurship. And so the irony of a very old institution built on not changing and the efforts of the Side Business School to valorize innovation and entrepreneurship is important, and I don't want to lose that in my comments. I want to hold on to that idea. But I do want to be skeptical about the word entrepreneur. I'm going to ask you to reflect on it and think about it as I say here. Wrong imagery, wrong idea, wrong kind of guidance, wrong skills, and in a sense, the wrong lessons. And I'm going to illustrate that with a couple of examples, some from my own research, some from other people's work. And at the end of the talk, at the end of these 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to ask you to simply take on board the idea of a system builder, somebody who thinks beyond the immediate enterprise, someone who thinks beyond all of the kind of imagery of entrepreneur. My concern there is this. The word entrepreneur, I think, has been captured by a kind of a notion of risk-reward. It's been captured by an idea of someone who is remarkable in a particular way. They're willing to take risks that no one else will take. They're willing to do things other people won't do. They're willing to free themselves from the bounds of sort of convention. And some of that may be true, but I think that the overall view of that word entrepreneur, we lose a lot of what actually happens. When you talk to people who make things happen in the world, and many of you are those people, and we've heard them on the stage today as well, they may not be interested in risks and some rewards. They're often passionate, and we've heard that today. They're often persistent, and most importantly, and this comes from the work of a colleague at Darden, Saras Sarvathi, they're often people who actually start with whatever they have at hand, and they turn what they have at hand into something more. So they start with nothing, they leverage, they bootstrap in some of the jargon, they are bricoleurs or they are recombiners, and they start from somewhere and they get somewhere else based on what's at hand. I think that's some of the insight that we saw in the presentation today about empathy. It's some of the insight that we heard where we're not talking in kind of an abstract notion of risk and risk-taking. We're instead thinking about people actually do things in very concrete material ways in the worlds that they're in. So my concern with the word entrepreneur is that it may blind us or cause us to neglect what actually people do when they change the world and when they have impact in the world. I want to illustrate that with a couple of examples and then, as I said, end by asking you to reflect on this for yourself. So this is a picture. Everyone knows what this is. It's an iPod. Everyone who's an MBA has heard this in some class in the last couple of years. The story here is the iPod is not an invention. It's a beautiful version of a Sony Walkman, right? We know that. And the value creation in the iPod comes not from the beauty of the package or even what's in the box. It comes from the wisdom, the insight that pulled together many kinds of players and in some sense embodied them in that box, right? So it's beginning to understand that value creation here actually comes from not the beauty of this particular artifact, but from all of the mobilizing of resources and wisdom and content and activity out in the world that yields easy access. And so if we think about this slide, then of course the story behind the iPod is really a story about marshaling and mobilizing and connecting many disparate worlds. And that's the claim I'm going to ask you to think about here. The value creation really comes from the assembly of heterogeneous elements. In this case, that happens to be content providers, new kinds of financing and struggles over the sort of payment models. But the insight here is really that value creation in this sense comes from the assembly of heterogeneous elements. And that's, I think, a powerful idea that when you think of system building, not entrepreneurship, you begin to think that way. A second example comes from some work I've done with Frank Hajek. Some of you may know a 2009 MBA alum who's an entrepreneur and actually an activist in Peru who's done a lot of interesting work around REDD+, the efforts to implement efforts to reduce emissions from forest degradation. This is a map of 12 projects that we're studying in Amazon, Peru, that are really efforts to take the idea of REDD+, the idea of this broad, emerging international protocol around reducing the damage from emissions that come from destroying forests, and instead find local projects, in this case 12 local projects, that are working with various kinds of indigenous peoples who are the asset holders and understanding how they make connections with other kinds of actors, civil society agencies, some firms, development agencies, partners in the international sphere. So this project that we're doing is really trying to understand what happens when these local project actors begin to combine in new ways with other folks, other actors out in the value system. This is a picture of one of our initial findings, a guy named Robert Percivale. You see him in the middle there outlined in red. Percivale is what I'm going to call a system builder. He's somebody who is an activist in Peru, but he's also connected to many different parts of this emerging forest carbon value chain. He's someone who understands you bring together asset holders with many other intermediaries who actually matter and create value. And what we're documenting in this study is we're really trying to understand the differences among these projects, how they're building these networks, how they're bringing people together, and what kinds of actors are getting combined to add up to this new forest carbon value chain. The third example I'm going to mention is something some of you know from my classes, a guy, very interesting historian of technology, Thomas Hughes, who wrote a wonderful book called Networks of Power. The pun here is networks of power, that is mobilizing elite power in society. But also, literally, this is the story of how electricity grid systems were built in the late 19th and early 20th century. That is, comparative study of Britain, Russia, France, the US, literally understanding what did it take to go from the idea of electricity, a new invention, if you will, a new insight. What did it take to go from that idea to large-scale power grid systems? And one of the insights, many insights in the book, you want to read it if you have a chance, but if you don't, one of the insights is that in each of those countries, the nature of the grid system looked very different. In France, in Britain, in Russia, in the US, in Germany, the form that technological system took, the form it took on varied. And the insight Hughes draws from that is useful for us. He says, actually, this is because system builders, the people who actually put these grids together, were more than just entrepreneurs. They drew on diverse skills. They worked with different kinds of people. They created new kinds of protocols, funding, financing arrangements. They reworked regulation. In other words, they worked across a landscape that until they came along had been unconnected. Wrong one, sorry. Until they came along had been unconnected. I'm losing it here. Until they came along, that landscape had been unconnected. And these are folks who really put together across these different worlds each of the elements, and in many cases invented new ways for them to come together. He talks about Edison in this way. He says, Edison actually stood in the middle of many different agencies, old industries, financial intermediaries. He built on the wisdom and the knowledge from the gaslight industry, the immediate predecessor to electricity. He also reached out to the railroad industry. In other words, Edison and the people like him were entrepreneurs in all of the conventional ways, but they were more than entrepreneurs. They really understood that the ability to have large-scale impact on pieces of the economy involved going beyond simply changing or entrepreneuring or being an intermediary. It involved really opening up new kinds of connections among parts of the world that were disparate. I think this insight has a lot of interest for us today, people interested in clean technologies, clean tech areas, really understanding the work of going on. The insight, I think, here for us also in this question of system building, Hughes said it takes not only building systems, but also unbuilding systems, pulling apart legacy systems. I have another example then. This is a line all of you know from William Gibson, the science fiction writer. The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. The insight here, again, is powerful. It says the elements of new opportunities, the elements of new combinations are around, they're available to us. It just takes pulling them together in new and different kinds of ways. And that skill, I think, is a system building skill. I'm going to skip a couple of the slides here just in the interest of time. This is a comment. Some of you were here when Reid Hoffman spoke last year, the founder of LinkedIn, and said, really, networks, understanding networks, are about how do I bring resources to bear from my network to my problem. So that's the logic, but I want to suggest to you it's not only about networks, it is about meaning, and it's about the ability to mobilize that meaning in fresh and novel ways. I think I'm going to just end with another quick example. This is a guy named Peter Rice. Some of you will know him. He's a structural engineer. He's a very interesting guy, and he became well known for working across the conventional boundaries between structural engineers and architects. In fact, he changed the way we build buildings. He changed the way that architects and structural engineers work together by being someone who understood his own expertise but could go beyond it, by being someone who understood networks and used those collaborations to create new kinds of combinations of value, and finally learned across many projects. So he's someone that I think is interesting for us in the same way. And I'll just wrap up. There we go. With a comment from one of my colleagues at Stanford, a guy who sort of puts all this in perspective. Jim March says, the formulation and dissemination of interesting interpretations of reality form the basis for constructive collective action. So in a nutshell, I'm asking you to take the idea of entrepreneur, value that work, but not get caught up in what an entrepreneur, what that has come to mean for us. A bit of celebrity, a bit too much risk-taking, a bit too much being special, not like other people. And instead begin to take seriously the idea of a system builder, someone who looks around, understands the kinds of elements that are available, combines those in new ways, and generates new kinds of value by virtue of combining heterogeneous assemblies and elements around. Thank you very much.